Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll start with Ms. Morissette. You mentioned the Alaska fishery, and there's something kind of positionally unique about the Alaska fishery when it comes to, Pacific salmon. They get first crack at the fish coming back to spawn. Because the circulation of the fish is basically clockwise, and it comes down to Alaska, and the Canadian fishers are kind of left with whatever's left over. So is the Alaska fishery a good model to look at when we're considering northern cod? I think you're on mute.
Merci. Ce qui est intéressant du...
What is interesting with the Alaskan model is the collaboration with the indigenous communities and the management authorities so that they can develop more ecosystem respectful management practices. So with the approach in Alaska, there's something that's interesting to explore, and this shows that inclusive management is possible, and it's also the key to success to ensure coastal fisheries resilience. I know that they work a great deal with indigenous communities to try and understand the ecosystems in a scientific way through measurements, but in other ways as well based on their knowledge, which is less standard, if you like, in terms of the scientific community, but it does bring interesting added value. So that's one of the examples where this different management recipe works well for certain species.
I have further questions. Thank you. Mr. Varty, the situation, and I'm not as familiar, obviously, with northern cod as I might be with salmon stocks because I'm a West Coaster, but the fish that we don't catch in Canada, do they end up in the nets in Iceland?
Well, historically, of course, the amount of foreign fishing in our waters was extremely high, and I appreciate that NAFO has been more successful in recent years, but the danger is that NAFO could once there's a bigger presence offshore, there would be more pressure on the resource and more likelihood of offending. But I remember in Newfoundland and Labrador, the year before the northern cod fishery, I was also the Deputy Minister when we declared a moratorium on salmon fishing. And in fact, I remember at the time with the salmon fishery that was, I think it was a $100 million program for compensation to salmon fishermen. And I said to myself, well, it would be amazing if we had to do the same thing with cod. And a year later, that's exactly what happened.
That's exactly what happened. Now, when we talk about mixing science with, the knowledge of indigenous communities and non-indigenous communities that are actually out in the water, there is a conflict there, because we could see the fishing communities exercising what you might call enlightened self-interest. They want to go out and catch fish to make a living, and who can blame them for that? At the same time, our experience in British Columbia with science, particularly around aquaculture, is spotty. I mean, that old quote, that you can lay all scientists end to end and they'll never reach a conclusion. So do we actually know enough from credible enough sources to really conclusively determine whether or not a fishery is valid, Mr. Varty?
I think the knowledge we have for management has improved over the years. I think the question about conflict of interest, there are ways to resolve that in terms of you do need to have people that are fishing the resource, whether indigenous or not indigenous, they need to be involved. But in terms of if there were a decision-making board, as there is in the case of the Offshore Petroleum Board, the people on the board really need to be people without a vested interest. So they need to be involved in the decision-making process, but not necessarily as a final decision makers, because of that conflict of interest situation. And I think that the indigenous fishery is a very important fishery, and to people, and it's there are a lot of very complex issues there that there needs to be a public forum whereby all of the debate can be tabled and discussed, and we can get an understanding as to what is the best solution and find a consensus.
The other thing that this committee has studied on both coasts that hasn't been spoken about here so far is the whole issue of pinniped and predation. You know, the explosion in the populations both on the West Coast and the East Coast must have, you know, a significant impact on the sustainability of stocks with or without, you know, any kind of a fishery from humans. Any thoughts on brave measures that might have to be taken and should be taken to deal with pinniped predation?
I think seal predation continues to be a serious issue. It has always been, but it's because of the escalating seal population, gray seals and harp seals in particular, but not limited to those, that the balance of nature has been disrupted, and there needs to be something done. And there recently was a major study done on the seal, the impact of the seal fishery, and the scientific measurement of that impact just within the last 18 months or so, and with very good recommendations for dealing with the seal issue through developing this industry, the sealing industry. And I think that's the kind of approach we need to take, is to try to be more aggressive, explaining how we have a sealing industry which is very environmentally sound and well humanely conducted, and so I think we've got to do more from a public policy standpoint to not only promote the seal fishery economically, but to explain to the public that it is humane.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll now go to